Hi everybody, welcome along to the fourth in our series of webinars to help you manage your diabetes for those who are 18 to 39. And tonight's webinar, we're going to be talking about everything to do with carbs. So just a few quick notes before we begin. Just to remind you that this is a safe and supportive space. So your cameras and microphones are off and your names won't be visible to others. You can send in questions at any time through the Q&A box, and these will stay anonymous too, and we'll answer as many questions as we can at the end. You will also get a recording of this webinar after the event. So just a quick reminder, the session has been developed by NHS Sussex for residents aged 18 to 39 living with type 2 diabetes in Sussex, and the content is tailored to the local services within Sussex. It's for your education and support only, and it doesn't replace any kind of personal medical advice. So always speak with your GP or your diabetes healthcare team before making any changes to your care. So I am delighted to introduce Louise Barber, who will be leading the session on being carb savvy, managing everything to do with carbohydrates. So please do ask your questions as well, and we'll make sure to answer those at the end. Louise is hugely experienced dietitian working within diabetes care for you. And Louise, I will hand over to you now. I'll bring your slides on the screen. I'll take myself off. If you've got any problems, let me know.
Hello everybody, pleased to be presenting this evening. I'm going to talk about carbs, definitely going to talk about carbs today. So just first of all, having a think about why carbohydrates matter in type 2 diabetes. So you can always pause the video a bit later, but you can think about some of these points here. So we're thinking about which one might be the incorrect answer. So we're thinking about carbohydrates. Are they a key source of energy for the body? The amount of carbohydrate eaten affects the level of blood glucose. Carbohydrates must be avoided to manage diabetes, and carbohydrate foods provide important nutrients for health. So have a think about which one you think is the incorrect answer. So we can say that we don't have to avoid carbohydrates to manage diabetes well. In fact, they are important, and all the other three are the right answer. So carbohydrate is found in many foods. So there's some examples on the screen here, because all carbohydrate is broken down into glucose through digestion, and we absorb blood glucose into our bloodstream from our digestive system. So our blood gets carried into the glucose to the cells, organs and muscles for energy. So the blood glucose increases in the blood if there's not enough insulin or the insulin does not work effectively. So being aware of our carbohydrates in foods and amounts eaten can help manage the blood glucose. We've got a bit of a diagram here to show us with that in action. So you can see there's lots of different foods there. All of those contain carbohydrates. The glucose is needed in every single cell in our body. So on the far right there, you've got the diagram that's just showing how the glucose gets in with the blood into the cell, and that key there is a symbol for insulin. So it needs insulin for that to happen properly. And in diabetes, that process is not working properly. There's things that are getting in the way of the insulin working well. May not be enough insulin, so that process is disrupted, which leads to higher levels of blood glucose over time. So one of the ways to describe carbohydrates is to group them into those that mostly contain starch. You can see they're found in cereals, potatoes, rice, pasta or oats. Our natural sugars, which are within the fruit and vegetables, and dairy or honey, and then foods with added sugar. And there's a variety of those, isn't there? We've got drinks, sweets, cereals, sauces, cakes, biscuits, as well as other sort of perhaps savoury products. So as I mentioned before, all this carbohydrate will convert into blood glucose, but there are some differences between those groups, and it might help just to think for a moment what that might be. So they're going to differ in terms of the speed of rise in the blood glucose. The starchy carbohydrates will digest more gradually, have a more gradual rise and impact on the blood glucose over time, whereas the foods with added sugar will have a much quicker effect, a bit more of a spike effect on the blood, especially if then in liquid form. Then we've also got the difference that the carbohydrate in the starches and the natural sugars, they're going to have some fiber in there as well, which has got health benefits as well as helping to slow the digestion. And there's other nutrients, aren't there? There's vitamins and minerals and sometimes some proteins as well. So then starch, carbohydrates, natural sugars are going to be good for our health benefits, whereas the added sugars are going to have a quicker impact on our blood glucose and not so much health benefit. So we're going to look at like just the variety of different starchy carbohydrates there are, because there's a wide range. So perhaps these are, we call them European starchy carbohydrate foods, so those that we might recognise, including sort of chips or breads, noodles, potatoes, rice as well. Perhaps more recently, we may have adopted some extra like quinoa, perhaps as a more recent addition. South Asian starchy carbohydrate foods tend to be made from wheat breads, flour, and the rice is used in many ways. Potatoes might be in mixed dishes and as a side. African starchy carbohydrate foods, so they might be made from vegetables such as yam, cassava, plantain, as well as grains such as wheat and rice. Starchy carbohydrate foods might include breadfruit, plantain, yam, sweet potato, and then wheat, oats, rice, and corn are the grains that might be commonly seen. So separate from that, we've got our foods with added sugar. So before we were looking at starchy carbohydrates, these are just a range of the number of foods that might have added sugar in them. So they're going to taste sweet, aren't we? We're going to know instantly when we've got foods that have got added sugar in them. And again, like I said, that they will affect the blood glucose much more quickly than the starchy carbohydrates, particularly the liquids. So the foods might also contain calories, high calories, because they've got added fat, and they may also have salt in as well, which has impact on our heart health and wider health. So if a food has got high sugar and high fat, then they might cause our blood glucose to stay higher for a longer period of time as well, which can have an impact. So just having another think now, so is it a fact or a myth that you can't eat fruits like mango, grapes, or bananas? Okay, so that is a myth. So all fruit can be eaten. A handful is suggested because it can help your body manage the carbohydrate in a handful. It's a sort of portion size. So even like a small banana, a handful of grapes, a slice of mango can be eaten. A wide range of colours is also recommended for different nutrients. And they're also another source of fibre as well. So it tends to be suggested to have whole fruit with the skins on, because you're going to have more fibre, there's more water, you've got the natural sugars, take a little bit of time to digest compared to fruit juice, which is going to have a much quicker pass through the digestive system and more of a spike effect. So any fruit can be eaten. It's a myth that you have to avoid tropical fruits, and you just think about that handful at a time of whole fruit. So when we're thinking about trying to manage our carbohydrates, manage our blood glucose, there are 3 different areas we can look at. So we're thinking about the type of carbohydrate first. So higher fiber or low glycemic index, low GI, it is going to have that more gradual impact on the blood glucose level. So there tend to be less processed foods, might be resistant starches, might be sort of firmer in texture, perhaps have other properties that make them a bit more slower digesting. So the type of carbohydrate is one thing to consider. So lower GI foods might be new potatoes, sweet potatoes, oats, whole grains tend to be our beans and lentils tend to be our low GI foods. Thinking about the amount of carbohydrates in a meal, so our portion size is particularly beneficial way to look at carbs to help diabetes. So how much have we got on the plate? Are we having pasta and bread, doubling up those carbohydrates? And then finally, if we balance our carbohydrate foods with other foods, So giving up added protein, healthy fats, fiber. Again, that slows the digestion and will lessen the effect on the blood glucose levels. So we're going to think of some practical tools next. So we're thinking about the types of carbohydrate, portion sizes, how we're going to put our meals together. So practically, we might use food labels to help us with this. We might use sort of fish-sized portions as a guide, and then there are also resources available. So when we think about food labels, we want to look at the back of the pack label, which tells us the total carbohydrate. So not just the sugars on, not just the sort of traffic light side of things. The total carbs are going to help you to compare between foods and get a bit more familiar with how much carbohydrate you might eat day to day. If you don't like food labels too much, or we want to use this method as well, thinking about the fist for portion sizes can be quite useful. So starchy carbohydrates might be cereals, bread, potatoes, pasta, rice, it might be other grains, corn. If we think about a fist size on the meal on the plate, it's sort of a way that might be individualized for body size, but also give you a bit of a guide of what might help my energy levels and not to have more than I need. There are a number of apps or books, websites, if you want to look at food a little bit more closely. They'll give you sort of calories and carbohydrate. So on the screen, we've got some Carbs and Cows, which is quite a good book. MyFitnessPal and NutriCheck are another one. Another just pause to think about the question here, really, what methods might be useful to use. So some people might have a preference for one or the other. You know, that sort of the portion size with the fist is quite easy to just go with without too much time. Other people really like the numbers and looking at the detail, and so perhaps some of the apps or the books might be useful for them. Or others might just think of a mixture of all at different times. So just thinking about some simple swaps now, practically on day to day when we're having our food and drink. You know, what can we swap to save carbohydrate, help our blood glucose? Also consider differences in calories, which will help health and weight. So we've got some ideas of similar snacks. So crisps, perhaps another crunchy, savoury snack could be popcorn. That swap could save you 93 calories and 10 grams of carbohydrate. Perhaps a typical chicken curry dish might be just the chicken and the rice, quite a large portion. If we swapped in some vegetable curry, a bit of a smaller portion of rice and chicken, you could save 576 calories, 61 grams of carbohydrate. Again, pizza, you're choosing a thin crust pizza, maybe 3 slices instead of 4, perhaps a vegetarian topping rather than lots of the meat and cheese. You could save yourself 500 calories, 29 grams of carbs. And finally, we've got coffee here, like a milky latte to a flat white. You could save 252 calories, 25 grams of carbs. So the idea is we're trying to think about what gives me a similar sort of taste and flavour snack or meal, but actually some of those changes really can add up. So finally, how are we going to eat our carbohydrates in the context of a healthy diet? We want to have a plate full of food. We want to look after our all-round health, not just our blood glucose. This model is quite useful for thinking about meal times. So, we can think of a common meal that we might eat and then sort of see about changes that could perhaps get the food groups into some sort of balance. So an example could be a carbonara pasta dish. So typically, that's quite a lot of pasta on the plate. There's a cream sauce, a little bit of ham, not typically any vegetables in that dish. So that, in reality, that would be a yellow plate, wouldn't be all carbohydrates with a little bit of protein and some fat. So maybe choosing whole grain pasta, for example, would help. Perhaps more of the could be some added chicken as well as a bit of the bacon. Could be swapping to some like creme fraiche, low-fat creme fraiche for the sauce. It could be stirring in some vegetables into the dish, or having a nice big salad on the side, and just sort of adjusting those portions of pasta for the mealtime. I know if we think about cereal, like a porridge, again, that tends to be all oats, doesn't it? And a little bit of milk. Sometimes people think, well, what could I add a little bit extra protein? Maybe some nuts and seeds on the top, perhaps a small amount of oats and a some berries on the side. And again, you're just tweaking that meal to see if we can get more food groups in, manage the portion to carbohydrates, but hopefully still have the same taste and flavour. So I think we've come to the end of the content now, which was all the things that we were going to talk through together, and perhaps think about some questions that might have come through. Just the mute button.
I think I'd remember that by now. Thank you, Louise. That was really helpful. So yeah, I've got some questions here, and if anybody has any questions that would like to ask on top of these, please do keep sending them into the Q&A. So what about a low carb diet? Because we've talked about carbs here, and we've talked about the fact that you don't need to cut out carbs. But if you were, say, on a low carb diet and then you were looking at introducing carbs, I guess people are a bit fearful, aren't they? What would be kind of some good steps to look at getting a bit more balance in?
Yeah, I mean, carbohydrates, we can sort of feel a bit negative towards carbohydrates because there's a lot of focus on them, and then we're really thinking about what might look after our blood glucose. But definitely want to welcome carbohydrate as our energy source, and a source of like fiber and lots of nutrients. So managing portions rather than avoiding, and as we looked at in the slides below. Yeah, so if somebody wanted to, I mean, if we had to define what a low carb diet, a very low carb diet might be, avoiding oats and pasta and bread, and perhaps mainly having fish and chicken and vegetables. So if somebody wanted to introduce perhaps those fist-sized portions, thinking about the whole grains, thinking about beans and lentils, you can transition to add in a few sources of carbohydrate gradually to your meals, and you've still got the benefits of it being looking after your blood glucose. So I think thinking about those low GI, whole grain, really nutritious and low processed carbohydrates, and you can feel confident that they're really nourishing, but you're putting it in the context of a balanced meal. So you've got, rather than that example where we had the carbonara, you've got your protein and your vegetables alongside.
Yeah. Someone else has just put in that, what about kind of reducing carbs causing low blood sugar levels, because they're wanting to reduce carbs a little bit, but how to manage this in terms of low blood sugar levels?
I think if you are taking medication that might lower your blood glucose, again, at the beginning might be good to just talk to your healthcare professional before you are. I mean, definitely for some of the diet plans, like low carb, we tend to talk about what we've mentioned today, which is a lower carb diet than the average diet. Most definitely, most people would reduce to some degree. But I think if you've got medications, talk to your healthcare professional before. Having some carbohydrates spread out at each mealtime rather than a lot and a little, and a lot can help. If you're going to do extra walking and things, you might need to take carbohydrate snack with you if you're on certain medications. So again, it's a bit difficult for the individualized, but I suppose it tends to be one of the reasons why we talk about moderate carbs rather than avoiding carbs and the very low carbs.
Okay. And what about sweeteners? Because that's something that comes up quite a lot, isn't it? That do they affect your blood glucose, and is that something that you should avoid as well?
It can be helpful to think of them as a transition product, really. They're a tool that can help people. The Diabetes UK tend to sort of have statements really that describe them that way. So if somebody was used to a lot of sugar and they're trying to cut down, it can be a useful way to get that sweetness and not affect your blood glucose, because sweets don't affect your blood glucose. But again, thinking of it as a journey and a tool, and perhaps aiming to reduce that sweet preference and gradually, come away from them might be a practical thing to do. But they are considered safe to use in the sort of quantities that we would typically use them day to day. And there's quite a range, isn't there, for people with certain choices. There's artificial sweeteners, natural sweeteners that come from a plant, or other products. So you can get a range that might meet your needs. But again, using them as a tool can be quite a helpful way to think about it.
Okay, brilliant. And what about fruit juice? Because you said about kind of having like you know, mangoes and bananas and stuff are actually fine. But what about fruit juice? Is that something that should be avoided or not?
Just for that spike effect on your blood glucose, and especially we might have our fruit juice with a meal, so you've got carbohydrates perhaps in the meal as well, you're adding a liquid source on top, you're going to have more of a rise in your blood glucose. I think fruit juice can be quite a tempting way to get your vitamins in, really, but the whole fruit would be better in terms of the energy, the less impact on your blood glucose and getting those vitamins in.
Okay. And I've heard, well, there's some stuff around like vinegar reducing the kind of you know, if you put vinegar on carbs, then it can help reduce the blood spike effect. Is that something that's a myth or not?
I think I would say a myth in a meaningful benefit. There are messages around vinegar for a couple of other sort of health reasons as well that tend to be not as founded as might be claimed, and there's a bit of a worry of vinegar. It can be quite erosive, so on your stomach, if you're having that, it wouldn't be something that we'd recommend. I think there's other ways that could help benefit.
So don't put vinegar on your donuts thinking you don't need to worry about it. Not so good for your teeth.
Might not taste. It might put you.
Might not taste very nice either. Brilliant. And bread. So you talked about whole grain breads, you know, and being kind of the ones to choose or your optimal choice. What about sourdough? Is that a good choice?
Yeah, bread, there's a big spectrum. Is it the best choice? Not necessarily the best choice, but I think there's a spectrum of choice with bread, really. But the whole grain, having pieces of the grain and the seeds in it, are going to be the longest to sort of digest. There's a little bit of less impact on the blood glucose from the sourdough, but the portion size is going to have the most impact. Changing the portion size of your bread will have the most impact. So yeah, whole grain, grainy, can be whole grain brown sourdough, but I think portion sizes perhaps would be the good thing to focus on.
Okay, so it kind of comes back to as minimally processed as where possible, and portion size are the kind of key things to consider around carbohydrates. That's super helpful. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining. Thank you very much for your time. And Louise, thank you so much for all your knowledge.
Thanks for having me.